All right, it's now 6 p.m. I would like to call the special planning commission meeting of Thursday, June 29, 2023 to order. And Commissioner Medeiros, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I will. All rise, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
And then clerk, can I please get a roll call?
Commissioner Correa?
Here.
Commissioner DeBreeze?
Here.
Commissioner Medeiros?
Here.
And Chair Aranda.
Here. All right, and moving on, I would like to welcome and introduce our city manager, Don Reynolds. Don, do you have any announcements or comments?
Thank you, Chair and members of the Planning Commission. I just wanted to welcome everybody here tonight. This was my first task when I started in 2019. We adopted 2 housing elements in 6 months. So that was exciting and a good accomplishment to get caught up. And so here we are back again. And this time we have Brian Fouch, Assistant City Manager, to lead us through the housing element charge. And we have until December 31st to accomplish this. I just wanted to quickly let people know that we're trying to do a better job of communicating what goes on at City Hall. And we're sending out our utility bills this week with a quarterly newsletter. So the newsletter will update the community on our water projects and some of the other things that we're busy doing, and hopefully raise more interest and get a better turnout at our city council meetings. So just wanted to make that announcement and say that we're open for business. And thank you, Chair. Appreciate that. And thank you for coming today.
Thank you. And all right, so we will be moving on to item number 2 on the agenda. Action items. And it's going to be section A 2023 to 2031 general plan housing element update and fair housing analysis. We are going to be receiving a presentation from Brian. Brian, would you like to introduce yourself?
I would. Yeah. Brian Fouch, Assistant City Manager, Community Development Director. And this is the first workshop that we have scheduled for the housing element. There will be other public meetings concerning the element when the draft element is prepared. We want to keep, sort of this process moving. We have at the same time that we're doing the 6th cycle housing element. First cycle, fifth cycle was 2019 to 2023. Now we're moving from 2023 to 2027. And as Don mentioned, we are on track to have this housing element adopted before the end of the year. We can go over the schedule for the element in a minute. I'll ask our consultant to advise us regarding where we are and where we're headed in that regard. But we are also doing a parallel planning program, which everybody understands. We're doing a community plan, and the community plan involves the selection of areas for future conservation and development, part of the city's general plan, and will be integrated with the general plan when it's completed. And we are on track to have that community plan hopefully in front of the public within late fall and hopefully before the end of the year. Whether or not the 6th cycle housing element adoption coincides with approval of the community plan, we will need to have an adopted community plan, and we'll need to have sphere of influence areas confirmed by LAFCO. In order for any housing sites within the reference in the community plan to be recognized in the housing element. And so until that time, we're dealing with what we understand to be our current sphere of influence, our current city boundaries, and our available housing sites, potential housing sites within these same areas. Because that's what LAFCO has recognized as our official planning area for this purpose. So that said, we have hired an experienced consultant to help us prepare the housing element. This is not something that staff can do without a larger staff. Certainly it's a very complex process that involves multiple state mandates. Our housing consultant will be able to go through those mandates with us. There's a PowerPoint presentation that he has available, and also to help us understand what the schedules are and what the, sort of the nuances are with respect to the end of the year and then beyond that. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Isaac George, and to help us understand where we are and where we're headed, what's been done so far, and what we're going to be doing next. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, city manager, and audience. My name is Isaac George. I'm from the Realty Planners Group, a consulting firm. I've been working for the last 30 plus years as a planning building director. And now I have my own company, and we provide at this time housing element updates for about 9 jurisdictions. Including a multi-hazard, multi-jurisdictional housing element, which includes the county plus 4 other cities for the Kings County. Basically, as the community development director has mentioned, this is a process that have to be done as among all the general plan, or also called the master plans that the city has. This is the only element that needs to be approved by the state of California. Any other elements can be adopted by the city the way you please, but this one is required to be approved by the state. Sometimes cities do not always agree with the state, and they do what is called a self-certification process, which is a legally complex one. Generally speaking, once we approve, adopt a housing element, it goes back to the Housing and Community Development Department of the state, and they will send us what is called a certification after we adopt it. That certification essentially qualifies us to be able to get CDBG grants, home grants, infrastructure grants, which are again part of CDBG, and many other grants from the federal government as well. Because most of what we do under the housing element is pretty much prescribed by HUD. So as a recipient of HUD monies by the state also has to meet requirements on a regular basis and submit their own reports California-wide to HUD and get it approved. So I will go through the PowerPoint, which kind of briefly takes you step by step as to what we plan to accomplish and what we have accomplished so far. And typically this first workshop is to receive the concerns of the community, which includes the Planning Commission, City Council, and members who live in this community, who are residents of this community. We want to ask them, what are your priorities in housing? What's your concern? Whether you have adequate housing for all income groups, low income housing, middle income housing, above moderate housing, this is called moderate and above moderate housing, or whether you have difficulties getting loans from banks, or people being discriminated against in the housing sector. And that's where fair housing comes into play. In the past, when we have done the 5th cycle amendment, we did mention about fair housing and we analyzed some of the issues, but the state has never asked us to do a fair housing analysis. Because the HUD is asking states to do that, even small cities mandatorily have to prepare the fair housing analysis, which is a very voluminous document and a lot of technical analysis that goes into, which analyzes the community, the types of issues that the community faces. And we will give you a couple of examples of what we have done so far. So without much belaboring, let me just go into the PowerPoint. The share folder.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Okay.
So we could go without it.
Okay, sorry.
So essentially, the planning process involves public workshops at the very beginning, which is one of these, which will lead us to prepare what is called a draft element. And that draft element will come back to the planning commission and the city council and the community members. There is a requirement by the state that prior to the draft discussed by the city, we have to give a 30-day notice to the public, informing them of the availability of the draft so that they can review it and bring us any comments that they might have. And we are also mandated to have a certain perfunctory basic environmental review for the entire document. California law pretty much allows us to go with the basic environmental review because this is a policy document and not a construction document. If you have extensive zone changes that happens as part of it, then of course it goes to a higher level of environmental review. But most of the cases, 90% of the cases, it becomes a policy document of the city. Then once the commission and the council approves this project, adopts it, HCD also gets the chance to review it. They have a 90-day period to give us their comments. And then we revise on the draft with responses to each and every point that they ask for. And finally, they will certify it. So this is the first workshop. The date here initially was 27th. We changed to 29th. So I make that correction on the PowerPoint as 29th. And later on, we will have a public hearing on the housing element and the fair housing review. And finally, we will do the adoption, as I've mentioned earlier. And housing element basically is a vision and plan on how best to provide housing for all income groups. And that's the critical language that the state imposes on us, saying that housing must be for all income groups. And it has to be done in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. It's called AFFH. The fair housing analysis is also called the AFFH analysis. And the housing element must be done every 8 years. And since we have had a lag in getting the certification some time ago, we had to do 2 4-year cycles. And that's one of the process. But the law since has been changed where you don't have to do any more 4-year cycles. The moment the second 4-year report is approved by the state, then you get into automatically an 8-year cycle. That's how the law has changed. The steps in updating is a review of the existing housing element. That had several policies and programs, and we will review the pros and cons as to what we achieved and what we have not achieved and why we have not achieved. So the state monitors it. In fact, on a year-to-year basis, we send what is called an annual progress report of the housing element to the state, where they also monitor on a year-to-year basis. We also have to do what is called a site inventory. So in other words, the state tells us through the Council of Governments that each city and county has to build in the 8-year cycle a certain number of houses. And these are called the RHNA numbers. That's a short form and it stands for the Regional Housing Needs Assessment numbers. So we do have a very small number. I believe, Brian, it's 88 housing, which is a blessing. In fact, 88 houses to build is not a big task in an 8-year time frame. When you have other cities requiring to build 26,000, 40,000, city of LA has to build over 500,000. So it comes with the jurisdiction, the number of people in the city, and the total households that we have. So it's a projection based on what we have, and therefore we have a smaller number. The affirmative action policies would again be based on the analysis that we do demographically as well as other factors that the state wants us to review, and blended with the demographic analysis that we do with the housing element. And the policies and programs have to be created in a manner that we further fair housing. So a lot of times the state wants us to have fair housing access for the public to come and file a complaint. Typically, small cities such as ours would not have that capability because of staffing limitations. And in that case, cities will work with the county to have any complaints forwarded to the county, and where they will address fair housing issues in that manner. And we do have that ability to do that. So let me also talk in detail what the fair housing analysis includes. The state wants us to look at key data and background information on what the city has and where we are going. Fair housing enforcement as it is done, what kind of enforcement do we do now? And what kind of outreach capacity have we undertaken to let people know that they can come to City Hall? We are accessible, the Planning Commission, the City Council, staff, city manager. What kind of access do we have at this time? And how integrated or segregated is the city? I mean, in the olden days, when we talk about these kind of things, it's kind of a dicey area where you talk about, oh, segregation. But now it has become mainstream in the analysis of these, as well as building the planning programs for that. So they will ask us to understand the community in terms of integration and segregation. And the Housing and Community Development and TCAC. TCAC stands for the Tax Credit Allocation Committee that gives loans to cities to build affordable housing. They created a program that will analyze every county and city in the state of California with all these kind of statistics. So we will show you a couple of statistics that we have analyzed based on those charts. So in other words, it is pretty much made up, and all we have to do is just go and see where we stand and what that data talks about and how we integrate that into it. And disparities to access to opportunities, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, because this is when we talk about, for example, city of Los Angeles, some areas probably have a lot of slums. And that's probably what you will find in blocks after blocks, impoverished and poor. So that becomes a concern of the state. I don't think we have that kind of a major issue like that in our community or smaller communities that I've worked with, but it has to be analyzed, and we have to see what kind of statistics is available. And we also have to look at disproportionate housing needs in the jurisdiction. What kind of type of housing is needed, and is there a disproportionality in what we build? In other words, are we building in Beverly Hills to the detriment of someone who just cannot afford? And the state's intent is to have a balance between all these different income groups. And that's why they are asking us to do that analysis. And then finally, displacement risk. Displacement risk is basically, let's say if we have some affordable housing here, which I know that we don't have any affordable housing projects here in the city. If, let's say, we do have one, then what's the likelihood that these people can be displaced? But typically when TCAC funds a affordable housing project, there is usually a covenant of keeping it for almost like 55 years, I believe. So the chances of getting anyone displaced from a housing project like that is almost there. Usually if you have those kind of projects in the city, we will call the managers and say, do you see any risk? Are there any issues? Is this property being mortgaged or transferred to some other entity? We do some kind of a personal interview with them to understand that. The site inventory is critical. Again, let's say the city proposes to meet that 88 housing units, few parcels in town. And the state wants to know, where are you proposing these? Let's assume that we have an impoverished neighborhood in the town. So are you going to put all the 88 in that somewhere? And you just found a vacant land and said, oh, we're going to build 88 over here. They will say, no, that ain't good work. So they want to build all types of housing in all types of opportunity zones. Opportunity zones can be high opportunity zone or low opportunity zone. So you don't want to package all your low income properties in a low opportunity zone. It has to be mixed and it has to be homogeneous in some form. But that's a high aspiration, but in reality, sometimes it doesn't work always like that. But at least in terms of planning, creating a policy, creating an ordinance, we provide equal opportunity for everyone to be able to use that and build if they choose. Now, the city, if we don't have the money, we have no obligation to build. Now, can we just say that and sit quiet and not do anything? That we cannot do. We have to legislate. We have to prepare for it. We have to create ordinances that will allow, and then the state would say, yep, you have done your job. And if nobody comes to build here, that's a different issue. And for a community such as ours, I've had the opportunity to roam around in the city where Brian has been gracious enough to show me a lot of properties far and wide. And one of the critical things that we have found in our community is the environmental issues that we are confronted with. Land subsidence, the Arcus Priolo earthquake zone, the FEMA areas that we are suffering from, where there will be flood, 100-year flood issues. So in order to mitigate those, they are often difficult. And when you really look at the city's boundaries, almost like 50% of the land is affected by just the Arcus Priolo zones alone. So that limits our ability to be able to build. Of course, we do have lots of vacant land otherwise, but many of those lands are probably in conservation lands, and the openness and things that has to be kept have to be studied and see how much is accessible and when is it accessible. So those kind of issues will have to be looked at as well. Now, the preliminary observations that we have found in just looking at the statistics between the decennial census, the 10-year census that is from the 2010 and 2020, we have a population of approximately 2,089 persons. About 60% are Hispanic or Latino. We have about 699 households, and we have 56.3% or so people are owner occupied. So the mix between owner occupied and renter occupied is roughly 50-50%, a good balance. Persons per household is 2.68, which is a very low number. It's very interesting. Usually when you have a higher level of Hispanic population, you also have a higher number of persons per household, which often leads to overcrowding. Say, for example, some cities have like 4 people on an average per household, but that is not the case here. And then you may say, why is that so? It is probably related to the level of education as well as their income. Because when we really look at the median income, look at that, that's $92,000 plus. So on a typical community, if you look at, they are roughly around 32, 33, 34. So there is always a correlation between education and access to opportunities. And that is very evident in this community. In terms of poverty, our poverty level is only 6.7%, which is not a big number. There are communities that have 30-40% poverty level. Now, if we go into some of the diversity indexes and things like that, this is one of those maps that I've mentioned that we drew from the state website. We have kind of a homogeneous community here. You can see right here how the gradient is made. The higher diversity is seen where you have like a darker green areas, and then the intensity comes lighter and lighter and lighter, and to the extent of having a low density. So we really don't have a lot of areas with the that stark composition or disconnect, and that's the point these maps make. In terms of the racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, the correlation basically assumes that the lower the income, the higher the diversity of population. And when we look at racially concentrated areas of affluence, that really would say if you have a census block group with $125,000 income or more, and a population that is 80% or more white, that means there is a predominant concentration of white people, then there is something that you can talk about the areas of affluence, and that's not the case here. The racial segregation map here literally shows that there is no racial segregation in our community. If you look at the legend there, you don't really see any blue areas within the city boundaries right here. There'll be like 30 or 40 different types of maps in the fair housing analysis. I just wanted to give you a sampler as to what these maps would look like. This is again about racial segregation of 2010 data, and we don't really have any racial segregation that we can see here. Racially concentrated areas of affluence, same. We don't really see any such areas in town. Disparities in access to opportunities. These are census tracts that are categorized as highest resource, high resource, moderate resource, or moderately changing, low resource, or areas of high segregation and poverty. And when you really look at that as well, we don't really see any major issues in the city. So generally speaking, ours is a homogeneous community. The interesting fact is that although it is 60% Hispanic, it is very high income and the segregation is low, and that these are good numbers for anybody to look at. We talked about proportionate housing needs, overpayment and cost burdens, and displacements. So I'm not belaboring more on that. We talked about site inventory and of that need. Then finally, we have to kind of identify as a summary to the fair housing analysis, say what are the contributing factors and what goals do you plan to have and what action programs will you have. And those will be set out in the housing element as what is called housing programs for the next 8-year period. And there we will have specific programs and we'll tell what we will do and how it will be done and in what time frame we will accomplish that. So in short, as I've mentioned before, we have a need to build about 88 houses. The highlighted data pertains to San Juan, and that is generally a low number compared to other jurisdictions such as the county or Hollister or even the unincorporated San Benito area. So then, what will we bring out in summary and present to the state as what is called a quantitative housing objective? Typically, the quantitative housing objective is what the RHNA numbers ask for. And in some communities, they would overstate their expectations, exaggerate that if they have plenty of land that is suitably zoned and available and say, yeah, we will build an additional 200 more of affordable housing projects. And you don't necessarily have to. And if at all, if you want to say, you can also say how much of what you plan to build of this 80 new construction, maybe 20, 30, how much would it be for rehabilitation? And that's where it's important to have a program for maybe some good code enforcement in the future, because rehabilitating existing housing stock is critical compared to the age of housing. So if we have to rehabilitate, we have to be able to have a good code enforcement program. We should be able to provide some kind of grant assistance to people, and we can get certain grants from the state. And I've talked to Brian about possibly looking at some opportunities in the future. And conservation and rehabilitation, again, conservation is if you have affordable housing, you want to conserve what you have and not lose them. So the general plans, as we have mentioned, when one element is amended, it has to be internally consistent and compatible with all the other elements. In other words, we cannot prepare a housing element which is in contravention to the land use element. Right? You cannot have two different policies that contradicts each other. So if it ever goes to court, they will say, there is an incongruency here. Go and fix it and come back. So we have to make sure that other parts of other general plan elements are congruent. We talked about the Environmental Quality Act, which is CEQA, and what we will do. So in essence, this kind of workshop aims at receiving communities' input in all these decisions. So basically, if we ask the community, we would ask them, what are the housing challenges facing the city? So if anybody in the audience thinks that there is a particular challenge, we would definitely want to listen that tonight. What opportunities are available to the city to support housing needs? Or if there are no opportunities, what should be the top 5 priorities if you ask what I need in the housing sector? So if somebody asks me, Isaac, what would you like in your city in the housing sector? I may have a few ideas, few expectations, few goals to set out. And I will tell my councilmen or board of supervisors that, hey, these are some of the things that we could do. And the public has the ability to come and address those to you as well. And what kind of fair housing issues or complaints and recommendations can we make? Has the city received any fair housing complaints? Or members of the audience, do they have fair housing issues? Have they felt any need for addressing those? And in that case, we could channel it in the right direction so that they get justice. And then the next question is, for the Planning Commission to ask any clarifying questions to staff from what you heard. And if you don't have any questions, open the meeting to the public to kind of elicit from them the questions that we posed as to what they think are any issues. If they're happy, then they don't have any issues. But if they're not happy, they may have some issues. Whether you are not happy or not, you may have some recommendations, some positive recommendations to give. So the next steps are preparing the draft, sending it for review by the Planning Commission and City Council, review by the state, and finally the adoption. So at this point, staff would like to conclude the presentation of the PowerPoint. Sorry, it has taken a little bit of explanation because as commissioners, you have had the opportunity to read it, but many of the members of the public may not have had the opportunity, and therefore we presented to them what the issue is, and it's minuted. And at some point, if city asks us, hey, what did you tell the public? Did you just have a meeting, minuted and went home? No, we did discuss orderly and in earnest. So we'd like to hear any comments once the commission opens the floor. Thank you for hearing.
Thank you. Yeah, so I would like to open up the floor to public comments. So I guess we could start here in chambers. Is there anybody in chambers that would like to make a public comment? Yes, please come up. Welcome. Yes, I can hear you.
I don't know. I find that now they're going. So, but that is definitely what the school, the media and muscle. And we do have a lot of people who are media and. So I'm just really critical of the. I think we really do. You know, at least we all do. I mentioned this before, and maybe I mentioned it 4 years ago. The city doesn't plan. They've got that. Corporation down here in Second Street, that's Toby. It's right in the middle of the residential community. And wouldn't that be a great plot of land where we could build some affordable housing? We have the nonprofit housing groups out there, we can build it and then we can move all of that down to the sewer, our sewage area down the hill. So I really feel that we focus on the and I know the city so that's
Thank you.
Just to answer Kara's question about ADUs. Our ordinance, even though we have an example of, a development using the inclusionary housing, using ADUs to satisfy inclusionary housing requirement, that is not permitted by our codes. So I don't know how that happened, but those are all deed restricted units. However, we need to come up with other solutions other than ADUs for our affordable housing need portion of the RENA number.
Okay.
Let me get some clarification on that, Brian. So ADUs do count towards arena number, or they do not?
The question is whether they can count for the affordable component of our RENA number. And I'm not clear on whether the ADUs can count toward our above moderate income, but they cannot be used by our ordinance, cannot be used for inclusionary to satisfy our inclusionary requirement.
Which would be very low income to low income, right?
Would be very low, low and moderate.
And moderate.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think the moderate, I'm not sure what the moderate income level is. It's got to be pretty high. And I think a lot of people would fall into that moderate income category.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else in chambers that would like to make a comment, please? Absolutely. Welcome.
Isaac George.
Isaac.
Was that in the staff report? Oh, that's an error, of course. Yeah.
So anyway, I have to do on, primarily happy. Because we. So I think all of the concepts. There are profits that got being said, you have two housing developments in town. And this one was what Juan said, I think initially was not 6 months of days. In 7 months of the top. The properly. Now we go into the real estate, you can see that there's now. 900. So that's really not a reflection here of us providing affordable housing. Also, like I said, you have to remember people that you don't have to go in housing like this, you know, not being there. So you have to attract money. The people that don't speak English, very good, very well. Because I can be in these areas where there is definitely lower income Hispanic residents living in 2 or 3 locations. And, you know, they don't have programs for the children. They're living in apartments, they're living, you know, there are lots of that. And that is what we're not addressing. The other thing is that just recently there was new rentals. To see what the rental was. The two was $3,500. Then there's a on Washington Street. First and last deposit for potentially, right? And that's rental. And then we have some property money that let their property that's good and going to rights. So we have to address that too. We have property have homes that could be very well rents and add to our inventory. That would be awesome. And you know, how do they bring in full, you know, up to the, you know, sometimes but the other thing is that she also addressed about the city water. That would really nice to address the whole of the population of city house, city house. We have a movement in the family raise the dollar for she doesn't go to the house. And I used to which is our 15 and the others are the areas of the rich and Japanese the good house. So the children come out, they do very well, just figure out, raise the, you know, sell the house for a lot of money. But yeah, they've got that's really low. And so, you know, they're napping with a lot of other cities in that position. And we have $2 million water for school. You know, we exposed to people. And then I saw the stats about the 88 homes that are here to build a scale. Even now, the first thing that's revenue housing. And we have finite enough. We also have all these state funding that are very good. So we get problem. So now keep that in mind. And as far as the what we have to propose for our EUA. And this once again, the ICM council other people will be about we just that that's coming down to our meeting. And you want 838 above water homes versus 18 water, 14 low, versus 32 really low. I think that pretty good is getting that people and then we kind of get them up to the moderate, above moderate. These kind of reflects what- So I think-
Thank you.
Good comments.
Since this is a workshop, I'd like to leave it to Isaac to sort of address the basis for the RENA numbers, if you will, in just a second. Keeping in mind that, well, first of all, the RENA 25% of our moderate and lower numbers can be met by rehabilitation. So right off the bat, if the city had a rehabilitation program and we were looking at rehabilitating units that were affordable, we would be able to take 25% of the 88, units, and we would be able to utilize or at least use that 25% rehab figure for to satisfy that portion of our RENA number. So that's available. The other thing is that the SEDS Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy is coming before the commission on the 6th in a similar setting. Hopefully there will be a well-attended meeting. So get the word out, everyone. But one of the recommendations that is not currently in the SEDS that staff's recommending is use of the city's facilities to accommodate some redevelopment. And so whether that's commercial, mixed use, residential, that remains to be seen, but that's a suggestion for the consultant, the SEDS consultant, to include those facilities in that planning. With that, I'd just like to maybe have Isaac address the RENA number. Keeping in mind, there's no reason that the city can't do more. Just because we say we've got 88 units doesn't mean that we can't, be
Sure.
more generous.
Thank you,
I have a
Brian.
question. That rehab program, are we talking about, just to clarify, the rehab program, is that ADU thing that you're trying to kick up that would help people
It
get their
could potentially
ADUs?
help that, right?
And
But that ADU health and safety number, that's not intended to address a RENA requirement. That
Got
just
it.
really intended to provide health and safety improvements
for just,
within our existing community.
so if we fix those ADUs up, or we granted, people money to fix that up, we couldn't apply that anywhere towards the 88. Other than low income.
I don't know, maybe Isaac can help with that question. But one of the things that we talked about is that the city has permanent local housing assistance grant money. It's a $325,000 over, I think, a 3-year period. Most of that money is being used to rehab, to propose giving money away for people to improve their properties. We sent out an advertisement through the water bill, asking people to sign up for the program, and we did not get one person.
Oh, I can get you
And-
some people.
So we're trying to stretch a little bit, and there's going to be, another, sort of effort to get people to submit the initial. I think people are just simply afraid that once they get into government and they get this money, there's going to be some sort of compliance measure, some sort of, now we've got you, but that's not
That's not
part
the
of this
case.
program at all. But this is the kind of thing that we need to tell HCD that we've got a housing rehab program that's operating now as part of our, sort of effort to meet those needs. But
Got it.
I'll let Isaac.
Cool.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Certainly.
There were two issues that I would like to respond. One, the understanding of what a median income is. Median income is the middle number of if you have a spread of, let's say, 1 through 10, the middle number, regardless of making it an average of the whole, that middle number is what a median number is. So essentially that tells us that there are some numbers lower than that and some numbers higher than that. So just because the median income is high, about 98,000 or whatever, it doesn't mean that a community does not have people living at 30,000 or at subsistence level. But that also doesn't mean that there are very many other rich people living in town who makes millions of dollars. So it's just a statistic that is arrived to express what a community is generally like. Averages don't always tell the picture because it kind of skews out the results sometimes. So the median number is generally taken for these kind of statistics. I mean, this is determined by the US Census. And number two, again, ADUs. ADUs are not necessarily low income. If I'm a rich guy, if I own $1 million home, and if I want to have an ADU for my guests, so be it. I'll build a very palatial ADU. It may be limited to 1,000 square feet or 1,500 square feet or whatever the city allows. That doesn't mean that automatically it's affordable income. But some people might rent it out to somebody who may be able to afford it at a lower rent. Say instead of paying 3,000, they may pay 2,000. And in that case, it becomes an affordable ADU. So ADUs by construct and by definition, they're not necessarily affordable. But although there is this thinking generally saying, yeah, you build more ADUs, that means you can allow people to live in there who has less means, subsistence kind of income, but it's not automatic. You know.
And I'd like to just, in that particular scenario, we've got a project coming before the commission pretty soon, as soon as I get the revised plans back into us, that we have, our ordinance was written to allow more ADU construction at the sort of the higher threshold of square footage in concert with the construction of an apartment building on the same site. So this is our ordinance predates this allowance, current allowance in 2023 by state law. So we are, really sort of sensitive to how well our ADU ordinance is functioning to promote infill development in San Juan Bautista. So that project, I think, is a good example of something that people can do to raise the density a little bit in a way that's compatible with our existing development. The other thing that people should understand here is that, and Isaac mentioned constraints a little bit. There's some natural constraints that we have. We also have a constraint through our historic preservation policies, and I think people are sometimes reluctant to make improvements because they're simply concerned that they're going to get an updated evaluation that says that now they have to do it a certain way. And we see this in some cases downtown, we see it in some residential areas, and that's why we hired a historic preservation consultant, so we can be right and not make assumptions about what's required in every case. These are real constraints that, and then the other thing is that the Housing Crisis Act of 2022, maybe 2021, applies to urbanized areas. And SB 9, you may recall, allows properties that are developed with single family homes to subdivide to create more, an additional unit or two, or maybe 4 on some of these properties. San Juan Bautista is not an urbanized area. And so some of these requirements that are coming from the state don't apply to San Juan Bautista until we get to 2,500 population. And then they do kick in at that point. That's something that to recognize as far as, what we think we want to do to maintain local control over, what happens with respect to infill and additional development.
Thank you. And then I have another question. So going back to, the medium household income. I know we're talking about the medium or the average. Is there a report or something that we can run that would actually give us actual numbers of, do we have a lot of, below, under poverty level people living here, or anyone, let's just say there are a bunch of millionaires. I want a more of a detailed report, not just, hey, 94,000 is the
Yes.
number.
Yes.
The census data and something that's recent, not from like 20 years ago, that would help. And that would kind of give us an idea of where we stand here in San Juan, because I think it is a little skewed there.
From the fifth cycle. Yes, Mr. Chairman, to give you a simple answer, there is a breakdown of different income groups in ranges of income as part of the US Census, especially ACS data. ACS data is the American Community Survey data, which is a sample data. The decennial census is an actual count data. But every year, based on a five-year increment, so 90 to 95, 91 to 96, on an ongoing basis, the American Community Survey brings out mostly these kind of additional statistic. And we will be glad to provide you that information. So we will know exactly how many are below subsistence, how many are the upper rates. So we get a better idea. Yes, we will provide you that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. One more thing, Brian has just given me this. Based on the fifth cycle statistic that we had in our city, we had very low income in households here of 142, low income 147, moderate income 178, and above moderate 321. So the above moderate category is mostly the people, and that kind of tells us that we have inflated or higher median income. That tells the story. But I will give you the ranges at a future meeting.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
And then I actually have another question. I think this might be directed to Brian. And probably another committee. If we were going to build these 88 homes, do we have what projects are upcoming, and do we know how many homes roughly would be built? What is the number? Where do we stand now with anything in the pipeline? And what is the number that we need to get to after that? And do we have land and areas for that to support that?
Yeah, I think within the existing sphere of influence, we have sufficient land. Excuse me. That's okay. Okay, well, there is no urban growth boundary at the present time.
Got it.
But there is a sphere of influence. So within the sphere that we have, that we all recognize as approved by LAFCO, there is sufficient land at the Community Health Foundation site. There's sufficient land, and that's in the city, but there's sufficient land within the Christopher Ranch proposed annexation area. And we don't actually have a subdivision application. We just have a proposal that would result in, I think, 160 units based on density, something in that neighborhood. Is that not correct? Go ahead and speak up. Okay, well, maybe it's 60 units. Yeah. Okay, well, he can, Bob can speak to that, but so. And then what was that? Right. Third Street by the wastewater treatment plant. So all of these areas, I mean, we're, one or two of these developments will be sufficient to satisfy our requirement. I understand that the Christopher Ranch annexation proposal will include, some units for to meet our inclusionary requirement that would satisfy those income distribution breakdowns in the arena number.
Got it.
So, we don't know what that means yet, but
And how can we, like, if we start building these homes, if how, what can we do, or what do we do to make sure that it is actually affordable? Like, we allow someone to come in, they build these homes. What stops them from still selling these homes at 800,000, $1 million, and we still don't meet the affordable living? So what can we do to ensure we're gonna build this house, but this house can only be sold to someone that's low income and it's only $400,000?
well, there are a couple of things that we're talking with people about. The first thing is we have an inclusionary housing requirement that requires 1 unit for every 5 be affordable within the project. Then in addition, what we would like to incorporate in the housing element and in the general plan is a preference for projects that actually have a set aside for areas that would be developed affordably by a nonprofit, where those units would remain affordable for the life of the project under the auspices of that nonprofit. And so, there's a couple of different ways to do this. One is through the inclusionary housing ordinance, and then that satisfaction of that ordinance, we can be creative about how we get there, with respect to set aside, for example, or some other means. But like I said before, we certainly wouldn't want to promote ADUs as a satisfactory housing solution for families. That doesn't make sense. So it's a very limited population that ADUs serve. I think what we're after here is a balanced supply of housing for various income levels that families can live in and contribute to the community.
Got it. Thank you. Any other questions in chambers? Yeah, please.
Yes, 8 years back.
11. Okay. We can wait.
Right.
Sorry, I'm going through my notes. Any other questions from the floor? Any questions from our commissioners?
Okay, that's working pretty good. One of the words that came out of this was the word opportunity. And how do we define that? To me, I'm thinking, when I'm looking through all this program, what we're trying to do here is set up an opportunity to balance our ability to build for all levels of life, you might say, to have a successful opportunity to live here. And no matter what type of income you might have, you have a good chance of coming here. And I think that's the direction we're going here with this whole program, and I appreciate that. But I wonder if we don't say enough about opportunities, how does that fit into our future? So now I think what we're trying to do is balance our efforts to build here into the future, so that we'll have a place where we do not have to keep people away because of income and all that kind of stuff. So that's the big opportunity. And I think we're headed in the right direction in putting this program forward. If we have to do it every 8 years, I think it's a worthy cause. Thank you.
One of the things that this housing element will include is an inventory of housing sites. And, so that list of sites represents that opportunity, I think, that you're talking about.
Any other buddy? Anyone else? I have a question for Isaac, actually.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm the guy of questions.
Appreciate it.
You briefly touched bases on, I think it was self-certification. If that was a route to take, what was that route and what would it entail and why would I do that if that is an option?
The ideal way is for the state to certify so that the state determines that you are fully compliant with the requirements of the state law. So if you ever get sued by a interest group, right, a developer or a nonprofit, when you have a certain certification, you have a better standing to say, yes, the state has deemed our plan to be fair, equitable, and compliant with the law, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't certify it. Now, this self-certification issue comes when there is a tussle or tug of war that happens between the state and the city. City wants to go one way, the state wants to go the other way, and there is no meeting of the minds in between. And they make up a plan and say, we think we comply with the law. So then it allows you to self-certify it, but that does not mean that you qualify for all the benevolence that the state can unload on you. The state may say, well, in our opinion, you still don't qualify for certain grants and loans and things like that. So it creates problems. If we can do, as Commissioner Maduro said, our goal is also to have a fair and equitable society and enable all income groups to have decent housing, then why would we have to just worry about some of the other things and we will do a self-certification. So it's not something recommended, but some cities go and do that.
Cool. Just looking at all our options and what they entail.
No, I think you are pushed into a corner when you don't have land and you have an umpteen number of houses to be built and you are in default, not being able to build. I mean, we were late in submitting our element, but that doesn't really carry a lot of issues. I mean, but we are a community that is fair, progressive, and we are not telling any people not to come here. And at the same time, the community has a very rich history that they want to preserve. And at the same time, we are inundated with environmental issues that we have to overcome. And if somebody has to overcome, it is going to cost a lot of money to build as well. So if somebody says, technically, we were talking about it, if you're in a 100-year floodplain or any floodplain, somebody can come and say, yes, we will elevate the baseline by 2 feet or whatever, and that will meet. But what happens when the street gets inundated? That's not acceptable to the city. So if the street also has to be lifted up, that's going to make the project unviable. And so there are issues of economics that the city is confronted with. We cannot ignore that. But at the same time, to meet these small requirements is no big deal.
Thank you. That answers my questions. All right. Go for it.
Brian, you mentioned a term a minute ago. I think I tried to write it down quickly, but I may have missed it. Inventory analysis or
Yes,
building site analysis.
yes,
Isaac, is that be a part of your study here?
yes, yes.
Can I hear more about that, what that will entail?
Sure. Basically, when we are saying, yeah, we're going to have this program, we're going to have this program, we'll bring the moon down. And then ultimately the state is going to say, where's the land? Where's the beef, right? Where's the land that you have to be able to build these 88 units or 100 units or 200 units? I mean, we are very benevolent. We say, okay, we are not only going to build 88, we are also going to build a lot more. In the sense, the city doesn't have the money, you cannot build, right? Where does the city bring the money from? So it has to come from a state grant, or the state will have to say, yeah, all right, we are going to grant you the redevelopment authority back to you. Remember, in the olden days, we used to have the redevelopment authority. We used to have monies that is generated, used for rehabilitating houses. The state took that right away from cities. Ever since that, rehabilitation has become a real issue. It has been a negative thing for many cities. So if the the state is going to bring that back to us, then we will be able to do. Now, ultimately, to answer your question simply, in order to be able to show that we can build, we need to have sufficient land. So let's say we have one parcel of land, which is zoned at 20 units per acre. So that will be able to build technically, 1 acre will build 20 units. You have another acre of land, which can also build 20 units. And that's the only land we have available. Just kind of assume. So in that case, you can only build 40. So then the state would say, well, what's your plan? So Brian will probably go and say, we're going to increase this density from 20 to 30. And we are going to do some recycling of some existing assets, as the honorable lady has mentioned, that we might relocate or use some of the assets that we have for a mixed use project or an affordable component within that project. And then we will assemble the parcels in a manner showing the density that we can build. And that's what a land inventory means. So because we have a lower RENA number to meet, we don't really have to come up with a lot of properties that is there. But we will, in general, give them all the vacant land inventory by different zone classifications and the average capacity that we can build, not the low, not the high, but the state wants to know what realistically that you can build. They call it the realistic density. And we will say, yeah, eventually we can build 2,000 homes here. So typically why that is important is because if you say you have just enough land for 10, they will counter that by saying, well, in an emergency, if you have to utilize a certain land with some different density, then what would you do? How do you do the substitution? So in that case, they would say you should have at least 15% more land available. In case of an emergency, you will be able to build. And say, for example, we said 3 or 4 pieces of land is suitable at certain densities, which will meet our requirements. But it is possible that the city may approve a project at a different density than we promised. In that case, the state law requires us to find a substitute piece of land and simultaneously zoned and made it available. Again, the whole thing, as I've mentioned, is that, it is not easy for cities to do all of these and just wait for things to happen. Unfortunately, the cities don't have money. If the developers don't come, nothing is going to get built. If the state doesn't give us the money, nothing is going to be built. But at least if we, in good faith, as Commissioner Medoro said, our goal is to provide fair housing. Our goal is not to discriminate. Our goal is to provide redress to people who need help from City Hall. Our goal is to be fair, and we have the resources and the means, and we comply with your requirements, and that passes. That's all what they are looking for.
Real quick. Commissioner, last year, 2019, we had several properties identified. The Manning property behind Valero, the next door to Valero was one. 70 Muckalemme is a property where the Chalmers house is. And we actually chose that parcel and increased the zoning to 24 units an acre. So we could get 65 units on that property. At that point, it was sold to the new owner, sold to the Community Health Foundation. But we were able to satisfy this need by taking that one vacant property and increasing its zoning and demonstrating to the state that we'd be able to meet our numbers, or I think closer to 25 or something, much lower. So that's how we made that. That's how we did it 3 years ago.
I'm familiar with the process. Brian, thank you for handing me this. As fifth cycle housing element, so this is an inventory prepared for
That's our current element. Yeah.
for the parent, right? And it says source ESRI. What does that mean?
That's the source for the base map. ESRI, that's GIS, source GIS map.
But who was it that went through this aerial of the city of San Juan Bautista and picked places where housing could happen?
I think that's a process that was completed by staff and the consultant. And recognized when the element was approved, recognized by planning commission and city council as sites that were available at the time.
Yeah, and the consultant would be, Groves, right? EMC did that.
Yeah, EMC planning, right?
And I'm not questioning it, I'm just trying to understand it.
Sure, yeah.
So you say staff and EMC planning went through, like, you can see some empty spots on here, and it kind of makes me wonder, how was it that some of these empty spots weren't similarly chosen, and what was the criteria and so forth, and therefore, how do we really know what the infill opportunities are? And that's my biggest question, and not only for our purposes here tonight, but also for the Urban Growth Boundary Committee and, kind of bigger concepts, is what are the infill opportunities within current city limits today, if every possible lot was built upon with, let's say, reasonable density, not to go crazy, but is that going to be any part of your analysis now for this cycle?
Yes, we will provide every lot in town, which by state law should be over 6,000 square feet. So if there is an infill parcel above 6,000 square feet, we will identify that with the parcel number. We will identify with the general plan designation, then the zoning designation, then the acreage, and then any hazards attached with that particular lot. Is it in the Alcus Priolo, or is it in the FEMA flood zone? Or is it in an oil and gas zone that you're gonna build anything? So we will identify that and give a complete inventory. So it will be useful for us to kind of keep track of what is available.
Very useful.
Yeah.
And who does all that work? You and your firm?
We and Brian combined,
I see.
we will do that. We will be assisted by the COG as well as the county. County has a GIS department. That company, ESRI, stands for the Environmental Systems Research Institute. They are an aggregator of spatial data, the foremost in the world. And they are in Redlands, California, and they make these spatial maps. And those maps are imported, and then data is imported into that, and then such maps are manipulated and created. So because that base map is theirs, everyone who uses that gives credit to ESRI.
And I think that particular map represents 130 units in the fifth cycle identified in the inventory.
And so when, again, just help me understand this process. When you and staff, Brian, do this work, are you using aerial photography
Yes,
primarily
yes,
to do that?
Yes.
And then as to whether one lot is chosen as suitable for housing and one is not for whatever reason,
It's based on the existing zoning.
okay.
So we know what these individual parcels are zoned right now,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
See, when you talk about land use, there are three terminologies. Land use is what you see out there. I see a vacant lot, I see a church there. What's the land use? The land use is a church. But what's the zoning? Well, that's on, that property may be zoned commercial. Would commercial allow a church? Well, it depends. A city might allow a church in a commercial zone, or it may not. It may be a non-conforming legal use. At some point in time, it was legal, but today it's not. It's continuous, and therefore it's a legal non-conforming use. So that is, one is land use, but that is different from the land use designation of the
Multifamily. Right. last question, when you do your work, for this cycle, are you going to be just regurgitating this, or are you gonna do it afresh, brand new? All right, and we'll be able to see that. Great. I look forward to that. Good luck. It sounds like a lot of work. Thank you for it.
Yeah, and one other thing, we don't ignore the fifth cycle.
Right.
Yeah, because we've got programs in here where we need to be accountable
Mhm.
and say what we actually did, and provide HCD with an update. So, you know, it's going to be new, but also based on our history.
Come up to the podium. Yeah.
Hundred and 30. Well, I think that it's the last RENA number was 41. So, you know, everybody's numbers got doubled in the state, basically. And our number now is 88, twice as many. Just because we didn't develop, I think last year we developed 1 unit. So yeah, we've got a huge development engine here. So, being facetious. So, we're not responsible for, there's no carryover with the RENA number. Every 5 years, it's a new number, and whether or not you got there or not, doesn't matter. The answer to the question is that's a capacity number, not necessarily related to what our regional housing need says we should do over the 5-year period. So, yeah, I know Isaac said 8. I think the RENA numbers are 5-year intervals, correct? Yeah, okay, so with the housing element being an 8-year element, you know, we might need to refresh that number in 5 years. But anyway. No, the 130 is a number that's relevant to the analysis that was done for the 5th cycle. That's a total number generated by staff and consultant based on densities for those properties that were identified as available for housing sites. So that has very little to do with the RENA number itself. Matter of fact, it has nothing to do with the RENA number. 41 units in the RENA number, yeah. I have to talk to Isaac about that a little bit because I think we have a difference of opinion. But we'll be sure to answer that question in the next workshop.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, this is great. The more feedback, the better.
No, there are different parts of the housing element. One of the requirements for the housing element is that we identify housing sites that are available for development. We need to at least show that we have housing sites that are available for our current number, which is 88. Because we only had 41 units identified on our RENA number in the fifth cycle, but we had 130 units of capacity based on the map that we prepared. So, you know, basically we had a lot more land available at densities that would result in 3 times as many units as our RENA number. Correct. Right. Mhm. We do know where the ADUs are in the newer projects. We know how many we have. But we hopefully through this permanent local housing assistance grant that we have, we'll have people step up and, you know, be able to recognize more ADUs that we don't currently know about. So hopefully that will help us get that inventory up a little bit.
Welcome.
Yeah, that's all true and correct. Thank you. That's great. One clarification, our ordinance does not allow counting ADUs to meet our inclusionary requirement, which is what I was saying earlier. Yeah, right. Our ordinance requires a certain percentage of units within new projects to be affordable to people who are very low income. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. And it's 1 unit for every 5. Right, and they can't be ADUs. So even though we can use them to satisfy our RENA number, our ordinance does not allow us to use those to meet our inclusionary requirement.
Yeah, go for it. Sorry, I'm just thinking, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a workshop. That, yeah.
Well. Well, let's be clear. Our inclusionary ordinance comes into play when we have a subdivision that's being developed, housing project that's being developed. It doesn't apply when in the scenario context that you're describing. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But based on the information that we just heard, it can be used to satisfy our RENA number for those various income categories. And if that's the case, we need to be sure that that unit is somehow going to stay affordable. And don't know that we currently have the mechanism to get that to take place. So we're not going to say, for example, approve an ADU and then go on the word of the property owner that that unit's affordable without some restriction. We don't really currently have a mechanism. Just believe them. This is a small town. We can just, we're all neighbors here. So, but we don't have a mechanism to secure that as an affordable unit currently. Yeah, we have to have an ordinance. Yeah. Yeah, we would. Yeah. Yeah.
Got it. Perfect. Yeah, go for it.
As long as we're talking about affordable housing, which I've dealt with a lot. I know I too was at the county for 15 years, and I don't know if I worked with you before in Chispa and South County. Oh, okay. But the thing that was very popular with the developers was in lieu fees. None of these guys wanted to build it; they just wanted to pay fees. And so the county collected a lot of fees, and it went into a designated account. Are you guys still picking up in lieu fees over there?
Yeah.
And the punchline is going to be: do we have an opportunity to in lieu fees here, by ordinance or otherwise? Okay. Oh. We just done it. But do we have, is there an opportunity for subdivisions to pay in lieu fees instead of actually building it?
I think it does, but my experience in affordable housing over the last several years is, in lieu fees are not enough to build a unit. You can't charge enough to actually put something in the ground. It's a much stronger and effective tool to have an actual unit built than it is to get a down payment.
No, you guys are stating philosophical positions now, and I happen to agree with your philosophy. But I just, like I said, I witnessed that developers like to pay in lieu fees a lot more than they like to actually build it. Or
Well, the other thing is that if you have in lieu fees and you want to establish a housing trust fund, for example,
Absolutely.
then-
Otherwise it's spending money.
then exactly. Under those circumstances, you want to see that fund build.
Right.
Question is there enough development proposed in the community to really make a housing trust fund effective in providing the number of units that we have or they're responsible for providing. So the likelihood is that we're probably not in a position to establish a fund or require end fees.
Any other questions?
You talked about that San Juan, the city of San Juan is not urbanized. Is that correct? Right.
It's not-
And
it's
what,
not-
what determines, where do we go with that in the future as we continue to build and grow? When do we become one or the other?
Well,
Or can we stay one way or the other?
it's a legislative,
Oh.
it's a legislative definition. An urbanized area is any jurisdiction with the 2,500 or more. So once you cross that threshold, that's it. Then the provisions of state law affecting urbanized areas, Housing Crisis Act come into play.
I think there's a list, and I think City of Hollister's on it, but we're not.
We're not on it, right?
Right. Start logging.
And that, we had the conversation earlier about how do you reference growth and growth limitations, growth boundaries, things that seem to read and are interpreted by HCD as growth limiting. And I think we need to pay attention to our vocabulary as we start talking about growth capacity, growth rate, growth limits, and our desire to stay within or below a certain threshold. These things are going to be looked at by HCD with a critical eye. And so we just need to be careful and cognizant about how we refer to things that address our growth through the housing element.
I have a question. This might be related to another meeting down the line when we're looking at development, but if we build 88 homes, let's assume, I think in your report, you said there's the most people in San Juan, I think there was 2 people living in that home or something like that. Or I forget what I saw in that report. 2 point something. Household size was 2. So let's just assume that that's the number, right? So we build 88 homes, 2 people in each of those homes, it's 176 people. Let's just say they had a kid, all of them, that's 264 people. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but with us building this and the state mandating that we build these homes, do we have what we need to build the infrastructure around it? Like, will our town be able to support, I know it's not that many, but our town is small. And so what does that look like? Like, if we're being forced, does the state help us pay for that? Or is that being put in by the developer? Like, whoa, pays for all the infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, those are mandated requirements for new development, is that, the developers are gonna pay for the infrastructure and the capacity improvements necessary through impact fees, connection fees and so forth. So the important thing is that we're looking at a housing element. It's one of several elements that comprise the general plan. So, we can't look at this absent looking at the rest of the general plan and what it says about growth and development, infrastructure planning, traffic and circulation, open space, conservation, and so forth. So this element cannot just simply be a standalone. It has to fit. It has to be what the law says, internally consistent. As planners, we all know what that means. It has to be, has to work within the context of the general plan as a whole.
And then, yeah, go ahead.
Follow up on that, conceptually, just so I can get an idea of scale, how much were the impact fees for Rancho Vista and Copperleaf?
I can speak generally to that, Commissioner, and together it brings up a good point. Both Copperleaf and both Meritage and Edenbridge had to pay a water solution fee, like more than $500,000. And that was to build, to move well 2 to where well 5 is, and to build well 6. So without that water solution, it's paid for by the 2 developments, those 2 developments were gonna be built. But there's a subdivision agreement that's negotiated. I'm sure Dan was part of that negotiation when it happened. And it talks about how much for schools, how much for parks, how much for public safety, how much for public facilities. And all those impact fees are lined up in the schedule. And I want to say there were several $100,000 each in total for the 88 units and the 43 units.
Okay, so do those actually cover the additional costs for the burden of the new subdivisions?
No, in fact, well, for example, I can just share with you that we use park impact fees to help put the restrooms at Rudy Park. So they're parks, right? And so, we use them for their intended use and we use them as quick as we can, but that's how we built some of our park improvements last year.
Thank you.
And then I have one more question, sorry. The other question would be, I think we said, 8 years, let's just say we had to build these homes or whatever that was. Or we don't have to,
We facilitate.
just plan for it. Okay, yeah, I was gonna. Yeah, we can do it. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, was there what would happen if we didn't? You know what I mean? Like, we just said we didn't wanna. Got it. So that's.
No. We will still get your funds. We will still get CDBG or other entitled funds because the housing element is certified. If this,
Don't get
No.
certified. Or let's just say we only build the 41 homes, but we decided, hey, you know what? We couldn't get a developer to build the other 40, right? And so then what?
The city is not a developer.
city is not a
And
developer.
yeah, so, whether the winds have changed, lumber prices, the
Mhm.
absence of skilled labor, high mortgage rates or, that kind of thing. We don't
Mhm.
have any control over those.
Got it.
So if it so happens that skilled labor just leaves, like it did recently, then, what can we do?
Got it. Okay. No worries. I was just trying to find out like what happens. Are we being penalized? Yeah. Like what happens, right? Like what if,
What happens? Arena numbers 88, what happens if 88
doesn't happen? Yeah. Yeah.
But it's out of our control. Is what I just said.
Ah, okay, got it. Yeah, come.
I didn't say that, but you- that's what you heard? No. For every proposal, a development proposal has to be analyzed for its environmental impacts. So one of the impact is that if you want to build 1,000 units, you don't have the sewer facility, you don't have the water to give, there is an impact. And if you don't have the money to build this infrastructure, you cannot build it. The city cannot allow it to build. And that's the law. That's the law.
Any other questions? Questions from chambers? All right.
Mr. Chairman, we also want to make it for the record that we did have a Spanish interpreter, and if anyone in the audience did not understand the discourse today, they could ask for the interpreter to explain it. So we wanted to make it for the record because HCD requires that at meetings we have Spanish interpreters.
That's great.
I apologize, I should have mentioned that at the very front, but
No,
for the record, I'm enunciating that.
for the next one, we can do it. I'll Liz, if we can add it to them.
Before we quit, maybe Isaac, can you go over next step? Just briefly?
Yes, Brian, the next step, I'm very pleased with the response that we have received. Right now, I'm consulting for 9 jurisdictions for preparing housing units, the same thing. A lot of places, we literally have to go after people to come and give us a comment. But here I'm really pleased with the comments that we have received. And I will get from the city clerk the names of the people who have spoken, because in some cases, HCD asked who spoke. So I will, if you don't, I mean, by law, you don't have to give your name if you don't want to. You can be anonymous, but at the same time, we would like to have it if you don't mind it. In terms of what could happen, because we are at a very tight deadline, I believe we have had a good response today. Our goal is to prepare the draft document. We are already way ahead in preparing both the housing element and the fair housing analysis. I would like to bring the draft document for you to discuss. And at the same time, the public can come back and we will publish the draft 30 days prior to the meeting. We will publish it on the internet. And so you can read what's in there and then ask questions or request changes or clarifications. And that will also have the critical programs that we are going to recommend. See, the gist of all this analysis, it's all background stuff. The key part is the programs that we are going to recommend to meet the state intent. So the public will be able to look at it. So that's the next goal, to bring you a draft document and discuss it and expedite it. In terms of the timing and the state law, the statutory approval is required by December 31st. And we are kind of late in the game. We are not sure, because of the review time that HCD takes. Their first review is 90 days. And looking at the responses that HCD has sent in the ABAG area, they are sending their response letters on the 90th day. That means they are busy, they are understaffed. So if that happens, we don't have sufficient time to respond again, and then they have 60 days to respond on the certification process. So it is likely that we might cross over the December statutory deadline, but the law allows us to adopt it within 120 days of that statutory date, and we will be fine. However, that 120 days additional that you can take as a little catch, it won't affect people like us who don't have a high RENA number. It will affect a bigger city, which will have to produce tens of thousands of other new homes. What the law says is that if you adopt it within the statutory deadline by December 31st, you have 3 years to prepare your rezoning, if you need to rezone to get the properties that you need to build the 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 homes. But if you extend into that 120-day period, then you only have 1 year to prepare the rezoning. So that's the only negative part and the catch. But in our situation, we will never come into that situation because we have a lot of vacant land. We can build thousands of homes, and we will demonstrate that we have the ability to build up. Whether somebody comes or not is a different issue. Okay. Am I correct, Stephanie? Am I correct? Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Isaac. Your presentation was great today. I think it was really informal. Everything about it was great. So I guess I will move for an adjournment. So the next regular meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, August 1st of 2023. There'll be a special Planning Commission meeting on Thursday, July 6th on the San Benito Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, CEDS. It is 7:56 p.m. This meeting is adjourned. And then, sorry, can I get a motion to adjourn? All right. Sorry. And I have to do it for Liz. A roll call.
Commissioner Correa,
Yes.
Commissioner Debris. Commissioner Maderos. Chair Aranda.
Yes. This meeting's adjourned.
Should pass. 4-1.
I've been working with the city and we're trying to get a memorandum of understanding written up, and we want it to include San Juan Bautista if you're interested.